From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks for joining us. Today's show gives us another opportunity to take a stroll down memory lane. The date is right about now in 2008, pretty much a decade ago. America was in full-scale freakout. Banks and financial institutions were teetering on the edge of failure. The auto industry was a step away from collapse. Bank America would very soon take over Merrill Lynch, and in about 2 weeks from right about now, Lehman Brothers just collapsed, done in by their massive collection of securitized subprime debt. Now, you probably didn't know what securitized subprime, you see what I mean? I didn't either. You probably didn't know what securitized subprime debt was in 2008, and even if you don't understand it completely now, you know we've been living with the fallout from it, whatever it was, ever since. And if you happen to have one of those crappy mortgages, you learned about subprime the hard way. So, even now, we get sort of twitchy when we hear about credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations and arbitraging tranches of quantitative subprime derivatives, okay? All right, I made that last one up, but the point's the same. We distrust financial wizards who keep coming up with ways to make money without actually making or producing a product. And it feels like that's just what the mayor of Chicago dropped on us a couple of weeks ago. He's come up with a plan to, I'll let our guests talk about what it is and try to explain it to you, but it involves borrowing a staggering amount of money and then hoping somehow it'll pay off our pension debt and save some money at the same time. Now, Hal Dardick wrote the first article that I saw about the subject back on August the 3rd, and that was in the Tribune, of course, and over the past couple of weeks the idea has been getting some play. So is this a good idea? Or more importantly, what the heck is this idea? The aforementioned Hal Dardick joins us once again at the Chicago Newsroom table. I'm glad to have you here, although I'm having difficulty this morning. And also, Ralph Martire is here once again, making a triumphant return to Chicago Newsroom. Glad to have you here from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability.
Always thrilled to be here, Ken.
A virtuous-sounding group, if there ever was one.
If you're going to have a think tank, you need a ponderous name, and really, Center for Tax and Budget Accountability is about as ponderous as you
I like
can get.
accountability. We all like accountability. So, as we are recording this morning on Thursday morning, rumor has it that Carol Brown is meeting with the aldermen and trying to sell them on this idea of some kind of bond something or other. Mr. Dardick.
Yeah, Carol is meeting and some of her financial team with aldermen behind closed doors. Well, we don't know yet what they're telling them, but we will later today. Every year the city does an investors conference, so they bring in people that potentially buy their debt, their bonds, and bond raters and all those people that are in the financial community, and they try to say where the city's at and try to put the best picture on how they're dealing with the financial troubles that the city has, what it faces, how it's going to try to deal with them. And there was nothing, this went on for a couple days, and there was really nothing new or of interest, the same selling points that the mayor's been using. And then they have a roundtable discussion, and Michael Sachs is on that. Michael Sachs is a close friend and advisor, financial backer, political backer of the mayor. Mm-hmm. And Michael Sachs sort of drops a bombshell because the big concern in the room, the big concern for taxpayers, is how do we handle spiking pension debt, not after the mayor or the next mayor gets elected. So it's going to spike by over $900 million between next year and 2023. So everyone's concerned, well, you're going to raise taxes. Michael Sachs says, well, I got an idea. Let's borrow $10 billion, pay down $10 billion of the $28 billion in debt in the pension funds with that money.
$10 billion, you said, right?
$10 billion.
$10 billion. Borrow
Yeah.
$10 billion.
That's
okay.
what
That just kind of floated by there.
Yeah, and here it's like 5 o'clock on Friday. Everybody's like, wait a second, and so it's been done before. They're called pension obligation bonds.
POBs.
POBs, yeah. And the idea is that in a perfect world, you invest that money in the pension funds, The pension funds
Wait,
make,
so you borrow 10 billion, so
Right.
you get this check for $10 billion.
Although calling it borrowing,
Yeah.
you're not borrowing one nickel of new debt. You're not incurring one nickel of new debt. This is money they already owe. It's debt they already owe to the pension systems.
Yeah.
What they're saying is, rather than owe this $10 billion to the pension systems, we'd like to owe it to bondholders. The reason for that is we should get a lower interest rate, which benefits taxpayers. And so the $575 million in bonds the city just issued through its securitization corporation got an interest rate on their bonds of 3.6%. Some of them are taxable, some of them aren't taxable. This would probably be a taxable
would be a
issuance.
taxable issue.
But still, they got an interest rate of 3.6%. Well, this same $10 billion, which is owed to the city's 4 pension systems, depending on the pension system, is bearing an interest rate of either 7.25, or 7.5%.
Bearing, you mean earning.
Bearing an interest rate.
It's a projected.
This is the interest rate they statutorily have to pay on their unfunded liability. So it is what the city has to pay. So if they could take debt, $10 billion in debt, and get a new lender that'll charge them a 3.6%, 3.8% interest rate instead of a 7.25, or 7.5% interest rate. That saves a lot of money right up front, doesn't incur any new debt. It's like refinancing your home mortgage. You're not incurring new debt, you're just taking advantage of a lower interest rate. And that could benefit taxpayers in a couple of ways. Way number one is it puts $10 billion immediately into the pension systems, which will move their funded ratios up to just north of 50% across the board. They're now in the high 20s. This would be a good thing, not a bad thing. You're not considered healthy at a pension system until you're at least 80% funded, according to the Congressional Budget Office. So it would move up that funded ratio. And because these assets are now in the pension system, the money is put in there, it will generate a return, reducing future costs. And it may allow them...
The pension fund itself will generate its
this $10 billion in assets that was loan proceeds, but put in there, will be generating a return as it's invested. And that should reduce future costs to taxpayers and may even allow, I think Hal was exactly right. He pointed out one of the biggest issues facing the city is the spike in the pension ramp, right?
I would argue it, crime is the biggest issue, but beyond that, I'd say that is the biggest issue.
I mean, they certainly, and there's no clear way to deal with that right now. I mean, there's not a fiscal path to deal with that. But they may be able to, by putting so much money in up front and looking at what the actuaries say that'll return over time in their estimates, et cetera, actually flatten out the ramp so that instead of this giant spike, maybe they have a little spike, but then keep it at a level dollar going forward. The key is to set that reamortization, that repayment rate at a level that does two things. It grows the funded ratios of those systems every single year. You don't want to go back to the situation where you're borrowing against the pensions anymore. So you want to grow that funded ratio until they're at some point healthy while covering all cash flow obligations of the 4 pension systems the city has to meet its obligation to pay benefits to current and future retirees. And that's a doable thing.
So if this is so wonderful, why hasn't everybody done this?
Well, it's been done in other locales with mixed success.
That's what I've read, yeah.
And here's the thing, and I think this is where it gets less certain, and that is you're investing the money in pension funds. The pension funds project earnings of 7, it happens to be the same number as
Right.
the interest, 7 to 7.5%. And if they earn a lot less than that, they've been earning in the neighborhood of 5, but over time, over 30 years, you can maybe make a case that they're going to earn this money. But if they don't, what you're doing is you're paying interest on the debt, the 3.5, whatever it is, and then if that loses money, there's a great recession or something, then you got to make up that money. Plus, you're still paying the interest on the debt. You could come out behind if it doesn't work out well. The argument, I think, is that over time it'll even out and it will be okay, just like if you leave your money in the stock market.
And in fact, Hal, that's once again always what the concern is in any arbitrage play where you're trying to take advantage of a differential in interest rates. But you can put into place a funding mechanism for your pension plan, so that even if you've leveled out your payments over time, it could follow what the IMRF does. If in fact you see real negative spikes in your return on investment over a 2, 3, 4 year period, you require an additional taxpayer kick in during that period of time.
Well, I think the state law would mandate that, wouldn't it? The way it's structured.
yeah.
So I mean, the IMRF mandates it. It isn't mandated.
Well, they have an actuarial funding that they have to go to in, depending on the pension fund in a few years. So I think, wouldn't that trigger a de facto sort of requirement?
You would hope. The thing is the mandatory part of it, the requiring the payment to be made. I think I would want to see that law tightened up to look a lot more like the IMRF law, that literally it not only requires the local governments. I mean, the IMRF, we talk about the terrible problem we have with pension funding in Illinois. IMRF is one of the best funded systems in the country. And the reason for that is the requirement that the local governments participating in the IMRF have to, over a 5-year period, make that contribution. I would like to copy that language.
But if those contributions have to get stepped up because of a loss and you're still paying interest on that, I mean, you could come out, it's not.
You could come out losing.
The principles, I would say, are sound, but it's not risk-free.
A couple of things. First of all, I, having never heard of POBs before I read your article, I did what everybody else does, and
I'm sorry to have done that.
yeah, I Googled these things.
You're happy about it.
And then spent a delightful evening reading lots of things about POBs, only to learn that lots of people have had reactions to them, and most of the reactions are pretty negative, saying that they, I mean, all the way down to Nobel laureate William Sharp saying it's like borrowing money to gamble. They don't have a great. They don't have a great reputation, and the other thing is that this thing about, I guess the word is securitized, right? That there must be sort of companion legislation that says at no time in the future, under any circumstances, no matter what the political parties say or what the newly constituted Supreme Court says, you must make these payments all the time. You can't start dipping in and taking it away, the way our delightful governor
Well, the securitization takes a specific revenue stream, and the state authorized the city to do that with sales taxes, and that was the bond that Ralph mentioned earlier that was issued earlier this year, and that they got a good interest rate on because the bondholders feel secure in that.
And whenever you have a dedicated revenue source, it always helps you with your bond.
Right,
rating,
but I don't think they'd have enough sales tax revenue to do this one. They may have to go to the legislature and get further authorization to dedicate some other revenue stream in this case. But here's where some people criticize that, and that is, if you do that, you're putting those bondholders first in line. As I understand it, in Detroit, when they defaulted, the securitized bondholders got their payment, and the others, basic general debt from general obligation, got shafted.
It's a risk in bankruptcy, but Illinois has not passed legislation enabling bankruptcy declarations by municipal governments. So City of Chicago doesn't have the authority to declare bankruptcy. The state would have to pass legislation that enables the city to declare bankruptcy. And you know, the nature of this debt doesn't change. It would have a priority over all other obligations of the city anyway, because remember, our Constitution already guarantees the pension payment.
Right.
So this is constitutionally guaranteed debt anyway. So the fact that it would now be guaranteed debt payable to bondholders rather than the pension systems doesn't change the characterization of it would be first out.
But here's the
well,
thing.
the other issue with that too is some people say that, well, if you're dedicating a certain revenue stream to bondholders, and the revenue streams aren't great enough to do all the city operations, are you then putting bondholders before the needs of taxpayers for police service and fire service? It's garbage.
Although I understand that argument, Hal, but I want to get to that argument. It's really sort of the core of the issue, right? You're looking at the fiscal capacity of a municipality to fund its core services, and if you look at the city of Chicago, what are its core services? Police, fire, street, sands, right? That's the core services it provides through its corporate fund. It's the same tax dollar that funds those core services as funds the pension obligation. Pension obligation is constitutionally guaranteed in Illinois. You can't get out of it. Current interest rates that the city has to pay to those constitutionally guaranteed pension debt bond obligations are very high, 7.25, 7.25, and 7.5, depending on the system. They can, right now, get a much better interest rate. And certainly in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, at a minimum, it would save taxpayers money on the front end. And by putting those assets into the pension systems, it would generate some return. And that's a greater return than the systems would generate now because it's got $10 billion more in assets. So it will, even if the return isn't as high as you would like, it will reduce future obligations from what they are today. And that takes pressure off the taxpayer contribution. So it should benefit taxpayers and free up city revenue to fund those core services, provided, I don't know if it was you or you that mentioned what Blagojevich did.
Oh, well, no, we haven't talked about that yet.
Provided you don't do what Governor
Right.
Blagojevich did
Yeah.
and divert some of the money to cover your contribution.
I think
This is exactly the question that I want to get at. I mean, we live in a city where we have an ironclad law about how you elect or how you appoint a police superintendent until we don't, right? I mean, the city council can suspend the law for one day so that the mayor can appoint the guy he wants and then change the law back or whatever they did to get Eddie Johnson in. And, you know, we all remember the pension holidays, right? I mean, it didn't take too much for the state legislature to allow the city to just not make the pension payments for a couple of years or whatever it was. So there's this $10 billion just kind of floating around in that fund that we just got this money from, and there's going to be great incentive, let's just say, on the part of aldermen and some future mayor to dip into that. How can you build a firewall around it?
Well, the money it would be in the way it's structured, and I think Ralph wrote about this, that you have to have all these protections built around it. That money has to go into the pension funds. Once it's in there, you can't take it back.
I know that Ralph wrote about that. I read it. I thought it was a very interesting thing. But my skepticism says, well, if you can write a law that protects it, you can write a law that unprotects it.
Well, I think once it's in the pension funds, it's in the pension funds.
They can't get it out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And actually, to clarify one thing you just said, the city really didn't take pension holidays. CPS did. The city
Right. It was
the
CPS,
city
right.
always made its
Right.
statutorily required contributions.
Which weren't adequate. But
That's the problem, is the statute wasn't at all tied to actuarial
Right.
evaluations. And so, the city could say that it made its contribution according to what the statute required
But
every
that's
year.
relatively-
and that created an underfunded situation.
It's relatively irrelevant since the structure is the same. It was the same mayor making the same argument. It was just a different fund, as far as I can tell, right? In the case of taking a pension holiday for the
Not
schools.
really. I mean, the schools, they were in a crisis. They were underfunded. The state, I mean, unpacking that and the problems associated with that from a fiscal standpoint. Look, if you have a state like Illinois, which is the laggard in the country in the portion of K-12 funding covered by state-based resources rather than local resources, and you have artificially shifted way too much of the burden for that onto local property taxes, City of Chicago is saying, wait a minute, we're underfunded. The state's not covering it. We've got, at that time, 86% of our student population is low income, 90% of our student population is minority. Not only shouldn't we be getting the same as other areas across, we should be getting more because of that concentration of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. We're getting less. So they were in kind of a dire situation that was really, in part, created by the state. Now, their solution, let's just underfund this obligation that we constitutionally can't do. And in fact, the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund was 100% funded as recently as
it was.
2001.
Yeah, and
It's
something
amazing
we
how
forget,
fast
isn't it?
it drops.
Yeah.
Boom,
Yeah.
because for a decade,
You want to talk about
Chicago
a
put
ramp?
nothing
How
in.
about a ramp
Right.
down? Yeah.
So that was highly irresponsible and the wrong thing to do. And my organization testified against every request by CPS to have a pension holiday, and we weren't successful in stopping
Because
that
part of
trend.
the problem that you have here is that, I mean, I don't know if I'm right about this, but it feels to me that a pension fund and a pension obligation is different from the operation fund for streets and sanitation, for example, which kind of is a year-to-year thing that doesn't really change all that much. But with the pensions, you've got this constantly rising need as more and more
Actually,
people
that's not
retire,
accurate.
right?
If you actually fund the pensions according to the ARC, the actually required contribution, sorry for using geek terminology.
I thought you were just saying an arc.
No.
Yeah.
What you'll see is your normal cost of funding pension benefits over time will be relatively flat, and depending on what you do with benefits, it will actually decline over time, the dollar amount, if you do it right. And in fact, that's currently the situation at the state level. So if the state level, if you were to look at this monstrous pension ramp that we have between now and 2045, and the payments look like that going forward, like every year they rise at unattainable levels. But then you break down how much of that is repaying what's been borrowed historically from the systems in the past versus the normal cost. Normal cost is declining. And so really the problem Illinois has is a little unique. It's been bad decision making by the state legislature, happily joined in by previous mayoral administrations, et cetera, where they said, hey, let's underfund this long-term obligation to free up more money now to fund services, effectively borrowing against what was owed the pension system to fund current services. And that's a way to provide a level of services that's here and taxes are here. So taxpayers love that in the short term. They're getting a deal. But in the long term, you got to start paying that back.
Meantime,
Classic robbing Peter to pay
Paul.
Right.
And that's really what we did for generations in Illinois.
Yeah, and if that hadn't been done, you wouldn't see this this steep ramp that you're talking about. So, the problem is, and I don't know how you do this permanently, but there is now a requirement that it become actually funded pretty shortly, within a few years. But the problem is, and I think that you pointed out, is what the legislature giveth, the legislature can taketh away. So I'm really getting biblical today.
well, it's a kind of a biblical problem.
You do need all kinds of assurances, if you're going to go down this road. Can I talk about the politics a little bit?
I don't know. I can.
The interesting thing that I find about it from a political standpoint is the mayor's going into a hotly fought re-election contest.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
So, and
There's a mayoral re-election?
There's a mayor.
And so there's a couple things that he's been getting beat up about. One is the crime rate. The intractable problem, all the crime's going down and still at extremely high levels. And the other is, okay, financially, I think objectively, everyone can say, well, you've done a lot to address the city's problems. But we still have, and this is why the bond houses aren't raising the general obligation bond ratings, we still have this huge pension ramp coming up. And you're not giving us a plan for dealing with this. Well, voila. This idea surfaces. Now, sometimes good politics is good government.
Good government,
But at the same time, I think it does allow him to go into an election and say, if this gets approved, and they are still testing it, and I don't think they'll do 10 billion. I think they'll probably do less, 3 or 4 billion or something, because the market will only tolerate so much. But he'll be able to go into the election and say, well, you can't say I don't have a plan. I have a plan. And this plan we'll need more revenue, but we won't need to hit the taxpayers as hard as we would have if this works.
Well, and speaking of politics, one of his opponents is Paul Vallis, who ran the whole shebang for a while and fancies himself as a true financing expert. And he says the whole thing's crazy. He just blows it off. He says it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, well, maybe he needs a calculator. I mean, it's just the simple part of it for people to understand. If you currently had a 30-year mortgage you owned and you were paying 7% interest, and a bank came up to you and said, I will loan you that same amount of your mortgage for 3.6%, would you or would you not take that deal?
I would and have taken that
that's
deal.
all they're trying to do. It's not incurring new debt. It's saving money by lowering their interest costs. And in this case, the people's money they save are taxpayers' money. And it should, in fact, work, provided those protections are in place, provided all the money goes into the pension systems, and provided they still have to continue to make contributions going forward that don't allow the funded ratio to decline.
It's a little more complicated in that you're counting on a certain investment return in the pension funds over time. So
Right,
I
right.
think
But that's where
there's
it's
a
different
level-
from just refinancing
Yeah.
your mortgage.
Well, but let's think about that for a second. So those pension systems are currently owed $28 billion. Is that the unfunded liability? It's around
that's
that
what
area.
they
It's
say
around-
it is
it's
now.
According to
28
Hal
billion.
Dardick in the Tribune, it's
Well,
28
that's a
Oh,
great
that
source.
must be true.
You know, I always go to, if Hal Dardick says it, it is true.
Me too,
by
me
God.
too, yeah.
So it's 28 billion. And so if they put 10 billion in, that means they only owe 18 billion going forward to the systems. They've just reduced the debt portion of what they owe by 10 billion. Amortize that over 30 years, go to the current value of money, you've saved yourself a lot of money in what you owe. You can afford to lose a little in interest return on this
little.
10 billion, and you're still in a much better position. It would have to be a dramatic market dip for this not to work.
It would have to be significant. yes.
And so this is one of those, just to go back to Rod Blagojevich, Mr. Not Good Government, if in fact they had put every penny of that $10 billion bond POB that they issued into their pension systems, it would have worked.
Yeah, it would have. It would have, based on the returns that
would have
They
worked.
hadn't
yeah.
resisted the...
But there was this sleight of hand that went on where, what was the amount that he
2.7.
He took 2.7 and he used it to make the normal pension payment. So the state didn't put the other money in it was supposed to, so
Yeah,
it was.
yeah.
They basically used part of the POBs to cover a current operating cost.
Right.
Very bad.
Right,
Do not
very
do that.
bad, very
not
bad.
allowed
Don't
to do that.
yeah. I got to tell you, just some kind of weird personal level, that I was surprised to see the I don't know if I'd call it enthusiasm, but the guarded optimism on your part when I saw this, because I saw your piece in Cranes, and you say, hey, let's not just look the other way. This might be a good idea.
My organization, think about how we do what we do. First of all, my board of directors is bipartisan. It's got Democrats and Republicans that neither like nor trust each other at all. That's our starting point.
That must be fun.
That's a lot. Our board meetings are right. But second, really think about it, we take an evidence-based best practice approach to solving these problems. And we tie the fiscal side of the ledger into the service delivery side of the ledger. And then sort of the undergirding notion for all of it, it's the same tax dollar that pays for all these obligations. And there's only so much political willingness to raise tax revenue to fund core services and pay these outstanding debts. So what we try to do is look for solutions that in all likelihood will work over time at the lowest taxpayer cost, but satisfy all demographically driven needs for core services and allow the governmental entity in question, in this case the city of Chicago, to meet its debt service obligations, in this case to the pension system, which he constitutionally can't get out of. So we actually try to use two things, math and common sense. And here, a lot of both of those argue very strongly for issuing some POBs as part of a solution here. It's part of a solution. They ought to re-amortize their ramp going forward. There needs to be protections about the investment. But it's the kind of thing that could lead to a solution that works for taxpayers and works for the city's capacity.
Okay, now this is excuse me, Hal, I got to do this
Go ahead.
because I'll forget it.
Go for it.
I'll forget my question. I already have, kind of. If, for whatever reason, the earnings of the pension board, if the pensions don't earn what they're projected to earn, then the whole thing kind of just falls apart.
No, it doesn't. No, because you've got 10 billion more in assets in from the get-go. That means what you have to pay in has just reduced by 18 billion. So you need to lose enough to get to the point where you lose the value of that 10 billion you don't have to repay, plus the interest. They're not going to lose that much. I mean, it just seems unlikely that the differential in interest would get to that level. But you're forgetting the $10 billion that goes in front that reduces $10 billion of obligation going forward.
But those things
still have to pay
did
that 3%.
happen in the Great Recession, and these aren't analogous comparisons necessarily because of the financial wherewithal of the city of Chicago.
Sure.
But in Puerto Rico, in Detroit, Stockton, California, they did do this, and the Great Recession, and there was enough of a loss, and they were already teetering in many other ways that it contributed to bankruptcies.
Sure.
In those
But I do think, and I think you're right to point out, Hal, and you're always right. He's such a thorough journalist. You know, this guy's tough to be on a panel with because he knows his stuff so well. But you're right to point out that each of those situations, the fiscal capacity, the underlying governmental entity was way more questionable
It
than
was.
the cities of Chicago. Right. And they're actually in far worse condition. And so, and the interest rate
They didn't have our
differential
economy.
They didn't have our economy.
Yeah.
And the interest rate differential wasn't as significant at the times in each of those cases. And so there were a lot more risky elements to those transactions than there are to this one. But this one, honestly, should work out, provided, once again, you put those protections in place. The city can't renege on future contributions to the pension system. You have to grow the funded ratio every year. I mean, you need protections in place. It's not like this is a carte blanche, go do it, problem solved. But it certainly should be on the table. It should be part of a rational discussion, and it should be talked about thoughtfully and put in place where, put into place in a way that protects interests as well as you can.
I did read something yesterday about the investments that pension funds are making. And over the last 15 or 20 years, those investments have been getting riskier and riskier. That they're getting more pressure to produce. They need to get more money back. So they're willing to take higher risk investments than they would have 10 or 15 years ago. A, is that true? And B, is that something to worry about?
I think the state got to a point where there was a larger percentage of higher risk, potentially bigger return, but also bigger loss investments, and they're scaling that back now. I don't know, and maybe you would know any of the, I don't think the city pension funds are going down that path. Other pension funds in the country, I think California has had that issue.
Yeah, and most of them, when I say them, most of the trustees charged with investing pension assets have a fiduciary obligation, and part of that fiduciary obligation is to take a long-term diversified portfolio approach to their investment, and most of them do. And in fact, if you look at the state of Illinois, as woefully underfunded as that system is, and you even include the period of the Great Recession, but you go back, over 30 years, they got their 8%. That's what they got.
Over time. Yeah.
Over time. So they've been pretty good at it. And once again, you go to this situation, instead of owing your systems $28 billion at 7%, 7.25%, 7.25%, and 7.5%, you owe them now $18 billion at those various percentages, and you owe that other $10 billion at 3.6%. That differential, it will be awful hard for the markets to take away. That is just a significant amount of new funding in, and even if that new $10 billion generates 5 instead of 7%, you have $10 billion in assets you didn't have, generating a 5% return. That is going to reduce your future taxpayer cost from what it currently is growing at. That's the math.
There are these moments when a little light bulb comes on, and what you just said just introduced something to me that I had not been able to grasp before. There's 18 plus 10, so there's 28 billion in there, but 10 of it is only at 3% or whatever the lower rate is. So that really, that does make a difference, because I keep thinking that you're paying twice. You're paying for what's already there, and you're paying the 3%.
No, ideally you're investing it, and the rate of return is greater than.
Yeah. Okay.
Going back a step, though, whatever you think of Paul Vallis's critique or not, I do think he's right. At one point, I think there should be robust public hearings. Let the public vet this idea. Let people like Ralph Martire come in and talk to the city council.
Well, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, we're all about that transparency piece and that accountability piece, and more public hearings rather than less, and a thoughtful deliberation and an honest discussion. We would love those things to happen, but of course this is Illinois, so who knows?
Well, this is an argument that we certainly know that the mayor is going to make. He won't put it in quite these terms, but I just lifted this right out of your story the other day, Hal, that the overall taxes and fees being collected in 2018 by the city and by Chicago Public Schools are nearly $2.2 billion more than when Rahm Emanuel took office. according to your own tally at the Tribune. All told, the average family will pay $1,813 more this year in taxes and fees than it would have in 2011. So you can't say he didn't step up and do what had to be done to try to raise this revenue.
No, the flip
of course,
side of that
will
is,
work
no one
against
likes to hear that, but the flip side of that is that he did commit to a serious pension ramp. Some people, I think, the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability thought it should have been a little quicker, but he did commit to that. He has stopped using one-time revenues, the infamous sale of the parking meter system, to pay operating costs. He has gotten rid of other high-risk elements in the city's debt portfolio. So he has taken a lot of steps, and that money is going to two things. That money is going for those things I just mentioned, and also to upgrade a very out-of-date water and sewer system in the city.
No, there have been a
And
lot
he
of
inherited, people aren't talking enough, he inherited these problems.
He did.
And I think that's
And it was
important to keep on the
thing
table.
you talked about earlier about basically, what they did was they borrowed from the pension fund, if you want to simplify it, to pay everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And said someday we'll pay you back.
Yeah.
And now we're living in someday.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember some of those early meetings with Budget Director Alex Holt over at the City Club, where she was laying out these absolutely mind-boggling graphs of $680 million in structural deficit that Rahm Emanuel inherited, and apparently he's saying that it's down to like 90 million or something now. So there has definitely been progress, but that progress has come mostly by just raising a bunch of taxes, and he's ticking a lot of people off.
Well, but those taxes should have been raised earlier. I mean, so there's the
Absolutely.
problem. If for years,
Right.
So one of my least favorite political canards that's out there from a rhetorical standpoint is the phrase tax and spend liberal. If you tax to spend on police, are you liberal? No. Tax and spend is responsible. What you're saying to taxpayers is these are core services and we need to fund them with current revenue.
Right.
Borrowing to spend on current services is highly irresponsible. And that's what the city of Chicago did for generations. It's what the state of Illinois did for generations. And their lender was a captive lender that lent against its will, their pension
And
systems.
they lied to the people, basically, about what was going on. They said, well, we're paying for it. Well, they weren't.
They weren't.
And
That's fair.
and the other thing is that you really the property taxes. You have to take a look at that and put it in perspective. The city and school property taxes have gone up altogether by over $1 billion. Now that's the biggest chunk. Most of that money going to pensions. But the fact is, and people in Chicago don't like to hear this, but the property tax rate in the city of Chicago, by Illinois standards, and that's a whole other issue, is low. It's very low.
Yeah.
Still.
That's just the truth.
Yeah.
And of course, any serious conversation about trying to find other sources of revenue through graduated income tax and all that, those just fall on deaf ears, and doesn't seem like in our lifetime anything will be done about that.
Well, we'll see with, Pritzker if he gets elected, but of course there's got to go through the legislature.
Yeah, there's always that. Yeah. And finally, this just occurred to me with it. I can't remember the numbers on this, but I know that we send a very, very large check every year to the consortium that owns the parking meters. It's a lot of money. And if you took the couple of billion that they gave us initially that just got thrown into the budget and just basically thrown down the drain, I wonder if the city had just done the right thing, kept the parking meters, jacked up the rights just like they are now, put in all these meters and have them work, that money might have almost just paid off the pensions.
Actually, that's a place where a securitized debt issuance would have worked extremely well.
Extremely well. Yeah, extremely well. Well, dear viewer, if you've hung with us this long, then you really care about finances and the future of the city of Chicago, and we're glad you did. this to me has been a really enlightening and interesting conversation. I learned a lot, and that's always a good way to end a conversation. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Hal Dardick, investigative reporter, Chicago Tribune, and regular here on Chicago Newsroom. Glad to say. See you next time.
All right.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And Ralph. Excuse me, Ralph Martire.
People always get choked up. On this.
I just get choked up every time I think about Ralph Martire being on the show. From the CTBA, that's the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And thank
also
you.
the newly appointed Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University.
You are?
Throw that out there, yes. Following in the steps of Paul Green.
Yeah, you are.
The great Paul Green.
So next thing you'll be hosting the Chicago City Club.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have quite
handing
that
mugs to
relationship that
people
Paul
and
had,
stuff.
but he was
Yeah,
good
yeah.
mug hander.
He was a great mug hander. Yeah.
Yeah. So is this the wonkiest show you ever did?
It's close. I mean, yeah, it's in the top 3, I'm sure. Just imagining if you tuned in like in the middle of this, what would you think? What are they talking about? Okay, that's it. That's all we have for you today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with yet another show here on Chicago Newsroom. Don't forget, you can go to chicagonewsroom.org at any time to see any of our programs. You can go to this address here to see the CAN TV version of them. Lots of things you can do, and we thank you very much, and happy pre-Labor Day to you. See you next week here on Chicago Newsroom. Bye-bye.